Welcome to the Money Insights Podcast, where high-income earners come to learn wealth-building strategies that will take them from high income to high net worth. With your hosts, financial and wealth-building experts, Christian Allen and Rod Zabriskie.
Welcome into another episode of the Money Insights Podcast. I'm Christian Allen, here with my trusty sidekick and co-host, Rod the Pod Zabriskie. Rod, what is up, my friend?
Hey, I am doing great, and I'm excited for another good one.
Oh, I'm glad, because it's going to be a good one, and I am extra jazzed up.
Yeah.
I'm always jazzed up, but I'm extra jazzed up today. I've never said jazzed up so many times in my life, but I am quite excited about this episode, Rod, because we're going to be, well, I should say this. Our episode today is inspired by some very heated online debate that I created for a viral post that went crazy last week. So just for some reference, right? When I typically put a post out, it'll get a few thousand impressions and, maybe between 10 and 25 engagements or something like that. Well, I put out a post recently and it got, so far it has 70,000 impressions. And
Okay.
by the way, my biggest up until that point was 10,000.
Okay.
So we're talking a post that's 7 probably, and it's still going. So 7 to 10 times bigger than any post I've ever done. And it just happened to be probably the most controversial post I put out.
Apparently.
But I got to be honest, I didn't think it would even reach that many people to cause a stir. Well, my post was this: financial advisors are broke. Why are we listening to them? Or why are you listening to them? Something like that, right? And the idea behind it was basically challenge the idea that should we be listening to financial advisors? Do they really have the right path? And unfortunately, very often, they haven't found success in their own right. And so for me, it's a little bit difficult to say, hey, somebody that doesn't really get where I'm at, they don't get what I'm dealing with. It's not that I don't want them to be successful. It's just that I would be a little bit nervous to feel like somebody in that situation could give me the advice that I needed. Now, I'll say this. It's very much more, it is a nuanced situation, because in the financial planning community, you start broke. I was 100% a broke financial advisor for several years, right?
And you started on that traditional side as well.
Yes. And I that's it. I was a traditional advisor teaching the exact same thing. I get it. I do get it. But of course, at the same time, I also we want to be disruptive and challenge the idea that the traditional path that, again, 95% of advisors out there are teaching people is, less than effective. We'll call it that. We would typically just say it's broken, but right. And really the statistics all suggest that that's the case. Okay. So back to my post. I put that post out there, and you might not be surprised, but my financial advisor friends were not very happy with me. Right. Especially if they had CFP designations behind their name, because they take this stuff very seriously. So the thing that I also did is I put a comment. The very first comment was basically hey, I realized that this post isn't this cut and dry. It's more nuanced. Here are some things we're thinking about. And I gave the example of a great basketball coach that wasn't necessarily a great basketball player. I'm not suggesting that it is that cut and dry, your advisor has to be ultra wealthy. That really wasn't the point. I was just kind of challenging the idea that we want to make sure that we're listening to people who have had enough success that they can legitimately deliver the value that we need. And I would also suggest, just based on experience, all too often, the financial planning community as a whole is kind of struggling. And by the way, not due to their own fault. It's an industry problem, right? It's not it's not an individual problem. But so anyway, I can totally understand why the advisor community didn't like me for that. But the good news is, Rod, it is what inspired this, because it got a lot of good conversation going. And at the core of it, the conversation comes back to this: alternative investing versus traditional investing.
Yeah.
And of course, we always say our goal is to bring together the best of both worlds, while we also realize that we lean a little bit further to the alternative side than we do the traditional side.
Yeah.
But again, we do want to take the best of both worlds. And of course, the reason that we have so much conviction and belief in it is because we've seen it with thousands of people that we've worked with. right? And we've lived it ourselves. And so like, yes, we have a lot of conviction that this path builds wealth in a more dynamic, and creates the kind of, extraordinary generational wealth that most people are looking for. And then, man, the other thing is like, I just think people are tired of the idea that if I save, I'm super disciplined for the next 30 or 40 years, then I might be able, if I live long enough, I'll have a 20 to 30 years to, potentially be able to travel as my health declines. Like that's not the dream today. So anyway, for those reasons, this became a fun debate. Well, what's the topic going to be about? It's about, or what we're calling it is debunking the biggest myths about alternative investing. And so Rod and I put together 8 myths about alternative investing, because at the core, the advisors who were commenting, in my opinion, just didn't have exposure, understanding. They were looking at this alternative space as something that it actually is not. Therefore, I felt like this was the perfect topic.
I like it.
Okay. All right. Yeah, me too. Let's do this. So Rod, the very first one, and I'm going to let you take the first crack at it since I've been jabbering for 5 minutes here.
Okay.
Maybe 10. The first one is alternative investments are overly risky. And this is just like, this is maybe the most common thing. Alternative investments means risky. Alternative, ooh, gross word, means risky, right? Talk about that.
There's a lot of irony in the use of the word alternative for the specific things that we include in alternatives, which the 2 biggest ones that we include are business, like your own business, right? And real estate.
Yep.
How long has business been around, Christian?
It's been around a while.
How long has real estate been around? How long have people been owning and investing in real estate? So yeah, at its core, we're talking actually about investments, ways to invest that traditionally, like you wouldn't think of them as alternative. It's only because, especially over the last, I would say, especially 50 years, with the advent of the IRA, where people were given the task of creating their own retirement by choosing their own investments, et cetera. And then all of a sudden it became much more commonplace for individuals across the spectrum, across the economic, different levels for people to be investing in the stock market. And that became, so now we call that the traditional investment space, because that's just what everybody knows. In a lot of cases, that's all they know. And they assume that's the only way to invest and to grow wealth.
Well, it's like it became institutionalized quickly and marketed quickly that it very like easily overpowered these things that are just like typically people been doing. And again, it's the ease of it, right?
Yeah.
It's the electronicness of it, for lack of a better word, right? The fact is it was made so easy. Whereas when people think about investing in real estate, historically, they think about, I go out, I buy a piece of property, and I like physically just have to do all of those things that exist inside of real estate investing. And so then this market-based opportunity comes that's much cleaner, easier. I can still focus in on my job. I don't have to worry about, going and do, and I can still make money in the market. So like, I absolutely get the appeal of the market. It's just that what happened is it became, to your point, it became what's now, qualified as traditional, when, of course, it was at one point more like the alternative. It just became so easy, so accessible that it took over the alternative side. And now I would say this, the alternative side has started to do things that are catching up, which of course gives people today a real advantage. In 20, 30 years ago, it was much more difficult to invest in the alternative space than it is today.
Yeah. And one other thing I'll point out, and I have a feeling I'll keep coming back to this, it's familiarity. The average person out there who invests in the stock market, especially through their 401k or IRA, has very little knowledge of what they're investing in. For a lot of people, they have zero knowledge. They're just like, I just picked the retirement age category, and someone else is making all those decisions for me, and they have zero idea about what's happening, but it's familiar to them, right? And then when you say, well, what about alternative investment? What about investing in the stock market or oil and gas or debt funds or all these other things? And like, I don't even know what you're talking about, right? I'm completely unfamiliar with that as a conversation, as a way to invest. And so the perception becomes, it must be more risky. Why wouldn't more people invest in it if it wasn't, that becomes a perception as well. Everybody around me just invested in the stock market. What are you talking about that, with all this other stuff, these alternatives?
Well, and we always talk about this concept of risk-adjusted return. And if you
Yeah.
apply the principles of risk-adjusted return to both sides, you'll find that the risk-adjusted return the profile is often better or more favorable, right? Higher
Yep.
upside based on the amount of risk that I'm taking. And so
Yeah.
I think, to your point, it really is just a perception. There's not a lot of reality to it. Now, there's some other elements that play into that perception. For example, we're going to talk about this, but like compliance, like some people
Sure.
might view it
Yep.
as overly risky, not even necessarily just because of the investment itself, but because of the amount of compliance or lack of compliance that it exists within that space. So
Yeah.
there's like things to think about, but just the inherent idea that alternative investments are overly risky and or always more risky than
Mhm.
traditional investments certainly is 100% a myth. So okay,
Correct.
that's number one, Rod. Myth number two, and oh my heavens, I heard this multiple times. The next two, I heard it over and over. And, maybe I'm just like tunnel vision on this, but my brain cannot get around the idea that what they're saying is true. And they suggest that alternative investments are only for like the top 1%. So if you're ultra wealthy, alternative investments can work and like make sense for you and they're effective. But if you're not in the 1%, nope, don't even touch it. Suddenly it's like totally out of it's out of your league. And that's genuinely what I was getting from people. And I guess in my head, I'm just like, okay, that's great, but why?
The first thing that comes to my mind is that it's an extension of number one. In other words, you create your foundation with the stuff that tried and true, the traditional, just everyone's doing it, do that.
Yep.
And then if you feel like you've created that and you can afford to take more risk and you can go out and be more frivolous, then start to think about alternatives, but only then. I think that.
Yeah, I do
what comes
think
to
you're
mind.
right. Can I even just say this? But when we were going back and forth, they were also lumping in the strategies that we use with life insurance specifically.
Yes.
And one of
Yes.
the comments back and forth was, this strategy that you're talking about it only makes sense for the top 1%. And maybe it's the exact same thing you're talking about. Maybe they're just saying, well, because part of the strategy is to invest in alternative assets,
Yeah,
which
maybe so.
again, but it's just so stupid to think like, okay, lots of people invest in real estate. Like, it's silly
Right.
to think that it's only for the top 1%.
Right.
Like, it's an insane statement. Like, if you walked, let's say that I met with somebody and they make $150,000 a year and, they own their house and they decided, you know what? We're moving, but we're just going to hold on to the same house. We don't need to take the equity. We can make that move. Now, suddenly they're investing in real estate as $150,000 earners and doing and creating a really powerful wealth building, framework of formula
Right.
for it. But I don't think an advisor in that situation would be like, whoa, that is way too risky. And
Yeah.
yet, when we say alternatives at a high level, it's automatically, no, too risky, you're out.
That's a
The other
great
thing
point.
that comes to my mind, and this is one that drives me really crazy, we talk about it a lot with Dave Ramsey. It feels to me like it's almost like talking down to. In other words, it's you can't understand this well enough. You're not sophisticated enough to like understand this. Therefore, we shouldn't even teach you it. It may be more effective. It may be something that's really useful, but well, okay, as an example, leverage, right? So leverage, some people can use leverage poorly and they can even go upside down and it can be a really bad, ugly, difficult thing.
Yep.
Well, therefore, doesn't matter how many people use it in a more positive, impactful way, we just suddenly should not do it. And to me, that's what I get out of this statement. Like, hey, in my mind, if it's good enough for the 1%, it's good enough for me. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
and the fact is, like you said, it is accessible to much more than that. So
okay, and that's a great example. You're right. Like, if it was only for the 1%, then only the 1% would be doing it. But again, the very reality is there's a lot of people of all different economic, states of being that are investing in real estate and starting businesses. And like, it's just a ludicrous statement, but I'm not kidding. I heard it multiple times. Okay. And this third one goes right in line with it. You need millions to invest in the alternative space. Just like it's only for you if you have a lot of money. Talk about why we feel like that's a myth.
Yeah, this brings back a funny experience I had. So our friend Chris Odegaard, early on, we did an episode with him, and so he kind of told his story. Well, he wrote a book, Get Off Your ASS and Start Investing. I mean, I've got the name exactly right, but
something like that.
and what was funny is he shared a copy with me, and so I read through it and then went and gave him a review. Well, it's funny because when I was reading the reviews, people that had come before me, this comment was made. And basically, they were just saying, well, that's great for you. Congratulations. But lowly, little people out here who don't have millions can't participate in what you're saying. And what's ironic about that is that his whole book was all about kind of like the everyday person being able to do the kinds of things, because that was where he started. He didn't start with millions. He figured out a path and grew from there, and then now got to the point where now he has millions. That wasn't the starting point. So anyway, that was the first thing that came to mind. The second one is actually like a client of ours from a few years ago. And this is the kind of guy who was just absolutely determined to figure out the formula for how to build wealth. But he was starting from a point of very low income, maybe like $30,000, $40,000 a year. And so he was young, right? And just kind of getting started out. But he started doing real estate wholesaling. And basically what that means is you go find the property, you put it under contract, and then you go find another buyer. So you're not actually going to end up owning the property. You're basically like the liaison between the seller and the buyer. A little different than just being an agent, because you actually put it under contract, et cetera. But anyway, long story short, he was doing this, and that is not a kind of business for the faint of heart, right? Takes a lot of work, a lot of failure, but when you find the successes, then it really pays off. And so I'm just giving a really simple example of someone who, in that case, started with basically zero. Like, he doesn't have to pony up any money to start doing this. But then as he starts to create some money and can put money into it, then he can start to do larger deals and build on kind of the network that he's created. But
well, again, when we talk like I think this is true. I'm pretty sure it's true. We always hear it, the idea that real estate's created more millionaires. Like, a lot of times it's like for people, like a path that they can own and control and do something with. So for a lot of people, it's a path from poverty to wealth. Like, it is quite the opposite of being something that's just so complicated and so risky that only the absolute elite can do it.
Yeah.
It's kind of the opposite. And then another thought is, like, the minimums today are much lower than they've ever been. So it's not a situation where I have to have huge money. There's places that you can go get in the alternative investment side of things for, and dollar cost average even. Like, there's like, that's limited, but just as an extreme example, like, you can actually do that. And there's, more and more stuff that's for people who are not accredited, who are, maybe you're like, or have a minimum of like 5,000 or 25,000. Like, so there's a lot of ways that's absolutely changing. And then, of course, to your point, you can always be creative and do it even if you have no money. I mean, how many like courses and like podcasts have you heard about how to invest in real estate without any money, or like how to get into the game? And a lot of times, to your point, it's the wholesaling game. Like, I have no money, but you know what I can do? I can grind and I can create money using this framework.
Yeah.
And so like, it's just, again, so silly to say, to kind of throw that out there. You definitely do not need millions in order to be in this space.
Yeah. One last thought I have on this is, from that traditional financial advisor perspective, they actually have a word, like in their vernacular, they use the word alternative to refer to specific types of investments inside of that space. And that just occurred to me, and in your conversation, there's no way they missed this point, because you kept talking about real estate and all these other things. There's no way they could have missed it. But at its core, a financial advisor thinks about alternatives, and it's only these extra, like, special set aside things for.
But there's still mutual funds, that kind of stuff, typically.
Right. Yeah.
It might
but then,
be
hedge funds or things like that. Right.
Yeah. And you're right. Those are absolutely, lumped into the alternative space. And so, and again, often, and here's the other issue. Like I had a lot of people coming at me like, oh, this is like such a self-absorbed post and that kind of stuff. And like the irony is that the traditional advisors don't even have access. Therefore, they can't recommend this stuff. So like, I had people coming at me saying like, hey, you have this conflict of interest. And in my mind, I'm like, well, maybe I do. Like, in fact, the financial services industry, the conflicts of interest are built in it. Like that's not, or at least at this point in time, those things aren't going away. And I don't know how they do. Right.
Right.
But, and I would say this, like the real focus should be working with people that you like build a relationship with, you trust, that have a, a track record of success, all those things. That's like the core focus. The biggest issues that exist here is that they have no incentive to actually sell alternatives. So like every time I see these comments, I'm thinking like, okay, but you're literally you're not paid to do real estate, right? That's not going to happen. You're paid to sell stocks, bonds, and mutual funds, and maybe some like alternatives that are baked into an existing platform that somebody else has already vetted. And by the way, likely that every other financial advisor has access to.
Yeah.
And so, of course, you're upset with me suggesting that we should go outside that framework. And again, if I was sitting on that side of the table, I probably would feel the same way. Like, I get it, because, it almost feels like an attack. It feels like an attack of what they're doing. And maybe it is, but I really want to wake people up to this idea that like we're seeing it firsthand. People aren't building, I'm just going to use this word, extraordinary wealth by doing the invest in the 401k and, put the excess money goes in my brokerage account. I give it all to my broker and hope for the best. Unless I have like a crazy high income and a huge savings rate, then getting like really wealthy in that model just doesn't exist. We've met with thousands of people and it's almost always their personal businesses or the income that comes off of their high income. Like those are the two places that we find. And of course, the income from that they then use to invest. That's how people build extraordinary wealth. Like there's probably a few exceptions, but you would have to show me a lot of data to suggest otherwise, because my personal experience for the last 10 years has been 100% that more people are building wealth using the alternative side as their primary kind of bread and butter, and then supplementing with things like, I think about all the physicians that have their defined benefit plans. Like it's still valuable, right? Oftentimes their group or whatever is putting money into it.
Yeah.
Well, it's valuable and it's a part of the whole equation, but it's really not the core of what's actually making them successful. And that's kind of the primary point. Okay. We got to keep moving on, Rod. I really went on a tangent on that one. Okay. Myth number 4, alternatives lack liquidity, making them dangerous.
Well, let's talk about liquidity. Let's talk about a balanced approach to investing, right? So, because you could say the same thing about the traditional space in terms of like, not that stocks, bonds, mutual funds by themselves lack liquidity, but a retirement account certainly does without penalties, right? So we just need to take an extra step back and say, what kind of liquidity do I need in my plan, and then build it in accordingly. Because I invest in alternatives, I'm not saying I put every single dollar I have into a real estate investment that I'm not going to be able to access for the next 5 years.
Right. But that is 100% how it's put back to us, right? Like alternatives, they're too illiquid. Therefore, well, again, you have to be thoughtful in your whole financial world all the time. To your point, nobody is suggesting, hey, you've got $2 million. Let's put all that $2 million in this single real estate deal that you can get out in 3 to 5 years. Like, okay, if that's what's happening, then you're right. That's garbage. But nobody's suggesting that. And
the problem is if you think about your 401k and your traditional investments as liquid, then again, you're in trouble as well. I've shared my example where I probably shouldn't have been participating in the 401k at the just out of college,
early
making
20s.
$30,000 a year, and in the lowest tax bracket I would ever be in, and I'm setting aside this pre-tax dollars for now. It turns out for more than one reason. One, again, the whole tax thing. I'm much more likely to be in a higher tax bracket when I'm retiring than I was then. And number 2, there came a time when I needed that money, and it was not, well, I had to cash it out. I had to pay the penalty to get it. So I ended up behind the game by having put the money in there.
So I think kind of bringing this back together, I think the myth here is that the making them dangerous part, right? So alternatives as a whole do not have generally the same liquidity that I get from investing in mutual funds, right? So that part I think is accurate, The problem, the other element is where the myth really comes in. That does not make something inherently more dangerous. It just means that I need to plan and be thoughtful. That's all.
Which
right?
is true no matter what.
Which is absolutely true regardless of where I'm investing. So the same thing applies across the board. Okay, myth number 5, Rod. Alternatives are just kind of trendy, right? That's at the core of it. They're just trendy. So talk about whether, well, what do you think when I say that? Is that a myth? Is that truth? Like they are a little bit trendy, but
I would say that's true. But it goes back to my point I made earlier that what we term alternatives, a lot of the things we term as alternatives are not trendy, not new, not unusual. They've been around forever. Now, if you want to say crypto or other things that are new, alternative energy and other things like that truly are trendy, and I choose to invest in those things. Well, of course, if my mind is open to invest in whatever makes the most sense for me as the investor, well, of course, I'm going to choose things that you might consider trendy. But I reject the idea that that's just all alternatives fit in that category.
Okay, so I realized as you were, giving that very eloquent explanation on this, that I left out a critical part of the myth. It is simply that they're not just that they're trendy and unproven. That's the other part of the myth. Basically it's the idea that alternatives are popping up, they're new, therefore they're unproven, right? I think of a good example would be the real estate syndication world. There is a lot of people now, and a lot more people in that space than there was 10 years ago. And it very much is kind of like a newer thing. But the thing that I go back to is that the actual investment is very much proven, right? Again, how long have we been and seen people successfully investing in real estate? It's just wrapped in a different kind of frame. But at the end of the day, like the actual, we'll just say the art and science of investing in real estate remains unchanged. We still have to keep those same principles that make us successful on an individual level. We bring them together in a group level. But again, that's an important element. It is the same investing. Therefore, it's pretty hard to say it's unproven, right?
Yeah, I think probably the more accurate way to say that would be that I, as the investor, may be unproven, especially if it's brand new to me. I've never looked at it before or invested in anything in this space. Therefore, I need to be much more thoughtful, careful, do my due diligence, etc., and prove it out, right? That's up to me as an investor to do that. But that's not to say that the investment category itself is unproven.
Yeah. Okay, Rod, we're down to myth number 6, which is return on alternatives aren't worth the trouble. Rod, it's just too much of a hassle. I don't want to have to deal with that. And can I just say, I've heard this many, many times because it gets lumped into the personal real estate investing. Like I'm physically going out and finding a property and putting it under contract. And you know what, I'm going to do a value add. So I'm actually going to buckle up my work belt. What do you call it? Tool belt. Thank you. That's how intimately involved with that kind of stuff I am. So I've got my tool belt on. I'm going to get out there. I'm going to grind. Well, of course, busy high income earner probably doesn't want to do that. Right. However, there's just a world of opportunities that don't exist in there. So it's very much a myth that that's what I have to deal with. If I don't want to invest in that way, but I still want to be in real estate, I can absolutely do it.
Absolutely. And we've given several examples on there with real estate. But again, what's interesting about this category of alternative assets is that it's so broad. And what we've experienced is there are a lot of opportunities for people to invest in alternative assets in things that they already are familiar with in their area, et cetera, without doing what you just described. And the example I often give is the surgeon investing in the surgical center, right? Or the dentist owning the building that they have their practice in. Those are very easy ways for them. Oh, are you managing the property? Well, kind of, because you're actually using it. But it's not the same as getting renters, getting a call at 2 a.m. to come and fix the plumbing or whatever, right? You don't have to go to that level in order to invest in alternatives
So what I hear you saying is that there's creative ways to do it, right? Like to lump it all inside this idea that I've just got to be hands-on, completely involved. It's just inaccurate because of the wide array of opportunities. And you gave an example of in your own business, investing in your own business in some way. Well, technically that would be considered an alternative asset. And yet I think a lot of business owners know that that's been the number one, the best investment that they ever make. I say it all the time. The best investment that I've ever made has been inside of the Money Insights business, all day long, every day. I would say that. So it's really hard for me to hear people suggesting like, hey, you just can't do this because of, XYZ reason, especially when, a lot of those ideas are really outdated. Because again, there is a lot of places, a lot of platforms that'll let you get in for even a relatively low amount, still have strong returns, and not have that same kind of trouble or effort that typically comes into me personally investing in a real estate deal. Which again, it's kind of ironic because that's like the only version of being like really hands-on that I can think of. Like, I guess if it's an STR, but like some version of me directly. But like, think about it, Rod. Like how many places you gave an example of a debt fund. Well, there's a lot of places that are doing funds that are like have really strong track records of delivering great returns with their debt funds as an example. And that nobody's asking them to go in and manage it. Right. You just have to do the due diligence on the front end. That's all.
Yeah. And one other element that we haven't hit on here is aren't worth the trouble implies that, or maybe ignores some of the additional benefits that can come with investing in alternatives that you can't get on the traditional side. Two that specifically come to mind are the tax benefits. And the second one is cash flow. You can create streams of income through an alternative asset that's very different than the way that you might create income in the traditional space. And if you ignore those things, then you might think, well, if I'm going to get the same-ish return in the real estate as I would get in the market, it's not worth going over and doing that on the other side. Well, if that's what you think, then I can see that. But we've played out scenarios where a return or an investment that gives you on its face 10% return, but then you add cash flow to that turns it into a 18% return, and then you add the tax benefits and that turns it into a 30% return. Well, now hopefully you're getting into territory where it's like, oh, well, if I can do that, then it's absolutely worth it, especially if I can invest in the kinds of things we're talking about where I'm not having to be hands-on. I can be the limited partner and get those tax benefits and get cash flow. Well, that again, now is it worth it? Well, yeah, hopefully.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that's a great point. Those kind of elements have to be a part of the equation. And so again, to your point, if you're producing double the internal rate of return on it, then you play out the math on that, then you can see how impactful that can be. And again, sometimes it's just as simple as adding in the depreciation elements and, putting in a cost seg analysis and all of a sudden, which a lot of these places just do, they build it in, right? Yep. So again, this isn't like you necessarily having to go out and do those steps. Those are just what most good syndicators are doing anyway. And then they pass those tax benefits along to the individual investors. So to your point, ignorance is bliss in this situation, or ignorance is, meaning lost opportunity is probably the better word. Okay, Rod, moving on to number 7, compliance departments prohibit alternatives because they're inherently risky. Okay, so really quick, compliance departments absolutely do prohibit a lot of alternative investments. So that part is true. So the question is, why are they doing it? And of course, we're suggesting the myth is that just they're inherently risky, therefore they don't want to do it. Well, from your perspective, Rod, why would a compliance department not just jump all in on the alternative space and roll with it?
They're creating a level of, I'm going to put in air quotes, safety, right, for the investor. There's a ton of regulation around this, right? And you could look at that and you say, well, there's good reason for that, right? There have been bad players in the past, bad situations. People thought they were getting into one thing and ended up getting in, something completely different. And because that compliance department exists and does a lot of the kind of cleaning up for you, then you don't have to worry as much about that. Therefore, that means that because they can create that safety, you shouldn't go out and do anything outside of the realm of what they're doing, because I guess the implication is you can't get the same safety. Or the way I would say it is, well, now you just have to do your own due diligence. You need to go figure out some things instead of just letting someone else do it for you.
Yeah, I think that's certainly an element that exists there, and kind of goes back to that Dave Ramsey principle. Like, hey, you're not smart enough to play in that space, so we're going to give you a sandbox, and you need to be inside this sandbox at all times. But can I just also say it's as much for the advisors as it is for the clients. And the other thing is that there's this massive world of alternative investments. And so it's virtually impossible for a broker dealer to even get their eyes on 99.9% of all opportunities that exist in that space. So, and it's because, again, we're talking about private equity, right? Which is different than investing in the public markets. And suddenly you, instead of one big, massive public market, these are individuals or groups of individuals that are sharing their expertise and success in the things that they've accomplished and allowing people to kind of jump in with them and be mutually beneficial. They can produce bigger returns. The investor can produce bigger returns. But again, the problem is compliance can't get their eyes on that stuff. So, and of course, their job is to make sure that, do their best to make sure that they're putting people in things that they, I mean, I would say or say, but it's like, it's not that. It's just that they're familiar enough with to feel comfortable in. But again, there's this whole world that they don't even get a chance to like dip their toe in to find out if they would be comfortable. Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. And yes, there are bad players out there. We've invested in places that were kind of turned out bad players were in there, doing
absolutely
stuff, right?
But I've invested in bad players or bad situations in, regardless of where it's been in.
Both, yeah.
Right. How many bad players were involved in the 2008 crash?
Right.
Right? Like, you want to talk about bad players. Well, what happened to all those people who were committing fraud or giving out bad loan, knowingly putting out bad loans? Like, there's bad players that affect the public markets as well. While it's true that a single investment, and that this is maybe the big difference, a single, like if let's say that I have $100,000, I invest in the public markets, I invest in, I end up in a bad, like the impact of a bad deal could be less impactful or could be more impactful on the alternative side if I'm not diversified. So that's another thing that I think is critically important. And again, it's hard for compliance departments to like figure out how to, take control of this element, but people just need to know that they have to be well diversified. Like, that's still a principle that exists. It's one of the principles from the traditional space that we still believe in, right? Like, having multiple different deals changes the equation significantly to where, like, I can lose in a deal if something bad happens, but still win dramatically overall.
Yeah. Different deals, different operators, different categories.
All of that.
Spread yourself across different things and you'll protect yourself against those.
Okay, Rod. Myth number 8. Stocks and bonds are easier and safer than investing in alternatives. Go.
Easier than a lot of alternatives? Yes. Because I can have a Robinhood account and I can say whatever, $15 a week or $150 a day or whatever, buying strategy I have. And they've made it very, very easy.
Question for you, Rod. Is Bitcoin, would you say Bitcoin crypto is alternative?
Yes, it is. So that now was my whole point. That's why I said categories. Because yes, if it is a real estate syndication and the minimum is 50,000, well, clearly most people I know don't have 50,000 a week or 50,000 a month that they're ready to just dump into the, flow into the deal in the same way as you do in this kind of dollar cost averaging purchase of stocks or crypto. But because now crypto exists on that, we've seen debt funds where you can get in for as little as $100, et cetera. Right. So you can't draw a very distinct line and say all traditional investments are easier to get into and all alternatives are not.
Well, and I think Robinhood even has alternative options that you can start to play in, right? That are on the very same platform that take the exact same amount of work as investing in the market. So I'm using Robinhood. I went to a few different platforms recently when I was trying to add to crypto, our crypto account. And I finally I decided I like Robinhood the best of the three. And one of the reasons I liked it is just because it's just as easy to do it as it would be to invest in any other brokerage account. In fact, I would actually say it was easier than in most of my brokerage account type stuff. So Robinhood is making it easy to invest in the traditional world, but what's great about it is it's also making it easy to invest in the alternative space, which again, I think is one of the reasons that Robinhood exploded in the way that it has.
So does that mean that crypto is now going to be seen as traditional because I can get it on Robinhood?
Maybe. Although again, I think you can I think there's other stuff outside of crypto even that are starting to be put on the platform that really do fit more of that alternative space. Like they're probably still bigger players in it. You're not going to find your neighbor down the street who is great at investing in multifamily real estate and helps invest for, an investor group. Probably not that. Yeah. But again, we're talking about easier and safer. Well, we're suggesting here that it may not always be easier. And then, of course, on the other side, I would just say it's not necessarily one way or the whether it's alternative or traditional does not define the level of risk or safety. The actual underlying investment's what defines that. So again, instead of putting it in, throwing it into this generic box and suggesting all alternatives are just riskier, instead we have to take it a step further. Again, sometimes it takes a little bit of work, but we take that step further and we can just actually look at the investments themselves by their merits. That's what's going to determine the safety or risk. Therefore, Rod, there's going to be plenty of times. Again, this is so simple, right? Let's say I invested in some sort of a debt fund on the alternative side, and I decided to go with a small cap emerging market fund on that side. You could look at those and you might actually find that your quote unquote traditional investment is carrying more risk and therefore is not as safe as your real estate investment, which is backed by physical property. So anyway, that's just an example.
Yeah, I think it's a really good example.
Okay, let's wrap this thing up, Rod. So I need some closing thoughts from you. Why do you think these kinds, and we've talked about it obviously throughout here, but maybe just to put a bow on it, what's the primary reason you think that these myths persist? And again, recap, it doesn't matter if we've already said it. Let's really lock in on why these things are there.
Yeah, the two primary things that stand out to me are, number one, familiarity. People have been hearing about 401ks since they were a baby. Again, I'm talking about just generally speaking. Most households out there who, they just go to work, they contribute to the 401k, that's their track to retirement. That's all they ever talk about. Most Americans, I think, fall in that category, unfortunately. And so they hear about it. Therefore, they feel like when it comes to be their turn, that's just what they're going to do, and they invest in it. But familiarity doesn't equal knowledge or an understanding of risk, etc. And so that's the one piece I think that's probably the biggest thing. And then the second thing is, especially as it relates to kind of the impetus of this conversation from traditional financial planners, financial advisors, is that they have their area of expertise. They feel like they can do anything for you inside of that area of expertise, and you don't need to go outside of it. And so they're not suggesting you do that. And again, I know I'm being a little bit naive in saying that, because to your earlier point, everyone has an incentive for what they do, and they do not want you putting all your money elsewhere. Otherwise, what are they managing for you, right?
Yeah, they also have a narrative that they build within whatever that business is, right? And so that's okay. So as I was, heated going back and forth with some of my commenters that weren't really excited about our post there, Rod, I said ours, I guess it was mine. I can't lump you in on this one. You don't want me to, but I had a light epiphany.
Okay.
And this may not be all that surprising, but I determined that at the core, all of this debate that was happening, all of the frustration, the emotions, actually just come back to one really simple kind of, I don't want to say concept, but let's just talk about the framework that we have in each of our mind. It's really the model, cash flow versus accumulation. The traditional model teaches accumulation. It's not a cash flow based system.
Yeah.
And when we're suggesting this move over to this cash flow based system, then suddenly there exists this massive conflict. And it's both on the philosophy side, but it's because the traditional space has never created the opportunities within the model to actually help people create the kind of cash flow that we're talking about, right? I can use bond funds to create a cash flow, but we're suggesting
stocks
there are some ways that I can create cash flow, but I think anybody who's been there and done it knows that it's not the same, just not the same as actually using real estate to create cash flow, especially when you take into account all of the other benefits came with it. Anyway, so that was my epiphany, Rod. I just believe that at the core, philosophically, the fact that we believe in helping people create financial freedom using a cash flow model, like we just see it every day, and it's been so much more powerful than that broken accumulation thing. So that was my big final takeaway. What do you think?
I like it. I feel like that was a little bit of a role reversal. I should have come up with the cash flow thing, because you always tell me, like, Rod, that's the drum you beat.
You love the cash flow. You're right. It was, but it just struck me. I'm like, that is the issue. We like cash flow, Rod. They like accumulation. Okay. Thanks everybody for listening to us. If you like what you're hearing, make sure you go give us a 5-star review. We appreciate you, and we'll talk to you next week.
Thank you for listening to the Money Insights podcast. To learn more about the financial and business strategies discussed in this show, please visit moneyinsights.net. The views and opinions expressed on the Money Insights podcast are not intended to be individual financial, tax, or legal advice. Always consult with the appropriate advisor before making financial decisions. And if you're enjoying the show, please feel free to rate, subscribe, and leave a review wherever you listen to your podcasts. This will help others find the show and learn wealth building strategies for themselves. Thanks again for tuning in, and we'll catch you in the next episode.